Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. I acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario is located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I am proud to acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. I acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands, and it is on these ancestral and treaty lands that I live, learn, and work. Hello, and welcome to Perinatal Wellbeing, episode number 15 with my guest, Katie Lamport. Katie is a counselor in private practice in the Barrie, Ontario area. I first met Katie when I started a new job as an addictions counselor. Katie was fully pregnant and went on maternity leave a few days later. Katie was the first person I had met that was a gestational carrier, and I thought, wow, what an amazing person. On today's episode, Katie shares her story of being a gestational carrier, what all the preparation was like, and how the pregnancy went for her. Katie shares her story in such an authentic way that I had to keep asking her questions. So Katie's story is in two parts. Hi, Katie. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited that you joined me today to catch up a little. And we are former colleagues and we are friends. And I wanted to be able to share your story with our listeners because you have a really incredible story related to perinatal and experiences. And so that is what we're going to talk about today. And your story is about being a surrogate.
It is. And you can ask any questions that you would like to know. I'm an open book.
All right. Well, I would love to know what kind of prompted you, or where did the idea come from for you to think about doing this for someone or for a family? How did that come about?
That's a good question. So Dave and I knew couples who were having fertility struggles and just supporting them through the process and hearing their story and the pain and frustration and roadblocks that surfaced for them. And we did not have those experiences, but for some reason it was just always tough to hear how many roadblocks people experienced or the grief around their loss. And I had one friend who would share that no one wanted to talk to her about it. She was kind of the stick in the mud. Like she was, after so many losses, just it was all she wanted to talk about. And no one else wanted to talk about it. So she felt very alone, very isolated. And so hearing those stories just, I guess, grew my heart for people who had fertility struggles and just became something that I was interested in hearing people's experiences. So one time I said to Dave, would you ever consider being a surrogate for someone who hadn't even asked us? And he was like, sure, but we didn't give it much thought. I mean, it's a really big question, but we didn't go further than that. But I guess that word then became known to us because we had talked about it. We had just even shared that little joke. And then one day I was going to yoga and my brother called me, and he doesn't call me often. So I was like, what's up?
Right. What's going on?
And he said, would you ever be a surrogate? Now that's a pretty big question. So I was on my way to yoga. I said, let me do yoga. I'll call you back later. Thankfully, I was in my very Zen-like state. And
Excellent.
I said, let me talk to Dave and tell me a bit about the story. So it was his neighbor that was had gone through quite a few losses and had some frozen embryos and required a surrogate to carry the embryos. And so I told myself that I was open to this question. Something in it didn't feel like an immediate no, but I knew it was a big ask. So in my head, I thought, Dave will say no for sure, and I don't want to do this alone. So if my family's not all into this, then I'm not into it. And I guess I just thought my out was going to be Dave, but he was 110%
Wow.
into the idea.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did that surprise you?
It did.
Okay.
It did surprise me.
Right.
I know it's the female who carries, but I just felt, I don't really know why I expected him to say no. I did. I guess I just maybe was hoping for an easy answer.
Right. Yeah. Someone will make the decision for me.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't.
Right.
So then we just decided that it was yes to the next step. So we're willing to meet this couple. We're willing to hear their story. What will the process be like? We were willing just to kind of take the next step, not knowing where that would lead. Right. And we actually were gestational carriers, not surrogates. So we didn't use my eggs, which I think would have been different. I don't know that that's something I could have said yes to. There's many people who can. Yeah. But this felt like something I could do. I had good pregnancies. I was done having kids.
Yep. Which I'm guessing is an important step in a surrogacy or gestational carrier journey. Would that be right?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's something that the social workers would screen for. And I don't know that it would screen you out if you weren't done having kids, but the risk would be that if any complications did happen and it prevented you from having your own kids down the road via natural childbirth, would that make you regret the decision to being,
Right. How would that sit with you?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how old were your kids at the time?
My kids were, that is a very good question. You're making me think. Max was 11. Chloe was 8 and Phoebe was 6. So when we told the kids I was already pregnant, we just didn't feel like, we didn't know what was going to happen. Would the pregnancy take? This was already an embryo that had been frozen for quite some time, and they had already used a few of the embryos, which from what I understand, they decrease in viability. Yeah, like they get scored and they use the highest scoring embryos first. So we just didn't know. And so we decided to wait to tell the kids once there was something more to tell them. So we told them, and Phoebe was 6 and she was like, okay. Max also seemed to kind of just be okay. And Chloe was like, what do you mean?
Right. What does this mean?
How does this work? Am I related to this baby? So we got on a chalkboard and we drew it out, and she got quite the education around how many different families come into the world.
Yeah. They're all different shapes and sizes.
Right.
Which is, I think, a beautiful education for her to learn.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And Phoebe went to school and told her teacher, my mom's having someone else's baby. So in her 6-year-old brain, those were the facts. The teacher definitely had questions for me. Absolutely. I was more than happy to explain what was going on.
Right. Right. And so back to kind of, that decision-making going through the process. So you decided, okay, we're open to meeting them and learning more about the process, what this would look like. And can I ask then, what was that like, the meeting and kind of getting to know their story?
It was good. It was great, actually. We met them over the phone. So they were my brother's neighbors, which is how he got to know them and their story. And they shared with him that they were looking for a surrogate. And I don't know what made my brother blurt out, I should ask my sister if she'd do something like this. But he did. And then he asked and connected us. And meeting them was lovely. It was all four of us had a conference call. So Dave, myself, and the intended parents. And we all got along very well. We could ask very open questions right from the get-go, which I think is important. And both of us had really supportive families. So I think that also made a difference, that we both had places we could go to get the support that we needed for this journey that we were about to go on.
Wow. And so then how did you come to that decision, you and Dave, of saying, okay, we're going to do this?
It really, you know how I said we will say yes to the next step. It really was a series of saying yes to the next step, because there's so many health screeners, legal screeners,
right,
and mental health screeners that you have to go through.
Okay.
So it really just was yes to the next step. The embryo was frozen in London and we were living in Peterborough at the time. So it's about a 4-hour drive. The gestational carrier, the surrogate, goes to the embryo, not the other way around. So I would go to London for appointments and just kept checking things off. So we met with a lawyer, we met with the social worker, we met with the nurses and doctors who would do
right,
checks to make sure that my uterus could do this. It was about 6 months of those kind of appointments to prep for the actual transfer. So that's kind of really how it came to be, is that, let's just keep taking the next step and see. Having said that, we knew, we were hoping it would happen
right.
at this point. Once we said, yes, we're willing to take the next step, we were all in.
Right. Wow. And so that's 6 months of, checks and appointments and 4 hours from home, for some of them, and all these screeners and kind of like, can your uterus do this type of thing? What did that feel like for you? What came up for you in those 6 months?
I was not worried, which is interesting, maybe just because I felt like it was the right decision to make. And even before saying our first yes, I really did think long and hard about it. It wasn't something I took lightly.
Mm.
And I really felt like we were a family who could do this. Like I felt like we were equipped and ready to be challenged in this way. Like our family could afford this. And I don't mean financially, I mean in the whole scope. Our family we can do this. We've got what it takes. And so I didn't feel worried. I was able to reach out to someone who had been a gestational carrier, and she gave me a few pointers, which was go see your doctor and just get a checkup done so that you know where your health is now, and so that you can address anything for yourself before you go into this. So that was really good advice from her. And I think I felt hopeful. I really wanted it to work for them. Once we were in, we were in. we got invested. And so, and then I think I've heard this from other surrogates and gestational carriers as well, is that you don't want it to fail because you feel like you will have failed them. So I also became very invested in wanting it to work for them and wanting my body to do what it needed to do so that they could have a baby.
To me, that sounds like a big responsibility, a lot of pressure.
Yeah. I even as I'm saying it, I'm hearing the word pressure, that it sounds like it should have felt like a lot of pressure, and yet it didn't. I think I believed it would work.
Right. Okay. So it wasn't necessarily for you like a fear that it wouldn't work. It's just you had this belief, this hope that this is what I'm meant to do. This is going to happen. It's going to work.
Yeah. And just keep doing the next thing.
Right. Right. Next up, instead of, looking at that whole picture and kind of worrying about that whole picture, getting everything together. But okay, we're just focusing on this next step.
That's a good way to put it. That's how it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then it sounds like, because you were able to go through with it, all the checks and testing went okay.
Yeah,
and
we passed.
Okay.
We passed.
Right.
But things that they did look for were, do you have strong supports? Which I'm glad they asked, because having been now on the other side of it, I do realize how important those supports are. Are you done having your own kids? How's your own mental health? How was your own pregnancies? There weren't a ton of mental health screening questions. Like, we met with a social worker once. There was a lot of physical health checkers, but isn't that the way of the world?
Absolutely. Right. And that's what we talk about here is how much, our mental health is actually neglected in the system when we're having kids. That's super interesting. Can I ask what they asked you in terms of mental health?
There was no official screener done, so I can't picture like a depression assessment or any sort of assessment, formal assessment being done.
Right.
It was more a meet and greet. The social worker met us, Dave and I together. So I think wanted to see how our relationship was to ensure that we did have supports. But really, I think those were kind of the markers: is, do you have supports? Are you done having your own kids? And do you feel like you can do this? Do you feel, have you assessed that you feel you can handle what this will take? And then there were actually really good questions that were asked down the road, but I want to say they were more from a legal perspective than from a mental health assessment perspective, which was things about the female body that's carrying versus the embryo that's growing inside. So who has the rights? If something happened to me that I needed care and it needed not to be pregnant to have that care, who has the right to terminate? If the baby needed terminating, who does the intended parents get to make that decision, or the carrier? So there was a lot of really good questions that you might not think about beforehand that were asked and talked about and signed off on. But like I said, that was more from a legal perspective than a mental health perspective.
Right. And how, can I ask, like, how was that experience in terms of those legal type of questions and, having, kind of having to work out who does have the say in that, right? How was that experience for you?
That matching that's required by the answering of those questions is so important. And there's lots of agencies out there that do matching. We didn't have an agency. We were matched by my brother. So we didn't have an agency, but we definitely had people, like we had we had all the things an agency would set you up with, just not the agency that does the matching and support. But how was it? It was good to have the questions asked of us. I'm glad someone did that, because I wouldn't have thought of some of those things. So it sparked good conversations that the intended parents and us needed to have and needed to agree on. And thankfully, we were able to come up with agreements and sign off on them where everyone felt comfortable. They're awkward conversations for sure.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. But thankfully, that's, I think, what made it work, is that it was a good match between the four of us, that we could agree. But if you can't agree on any of those things, I think they're big enough that it would end the match, because they're too important to ignore.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Okay. And so what was the transfer like?
The transfer was such a neat day. I'm glad you asked about that, because to me, it was like a very special day.
Right.
Yeah, it's so fast.
Right.
You're in that actual transfer appointment for, I want to say, 5 minutes.
Wow.
Like, it was so quick.
Wow.
But it's such a powerful little moment. Like, they thaw the embryo and it's all ready, but they can't thaw it too early. So, like, us getting to London was really important, and the timing all had to be just so.
Yeah.
But they look at it under a telescope and make sure that it's moving and doing what it needs to do, because they could thaw it and it's not viable, which means the appointment's done. But it was viable, and they get excited. So then you're excited. Like, it's kind of there's an excitement in the air. And the intended parents, were in the room with us, which I was glad, because this was such a big moment for them.
Yeah.
And you get to watch on a screen. They follow the track to get to the cervix, to get the embryo exactly where it needs to be. And to me, all the science behind it was exciting and neat. And it's in, and then it's done. And you kind of feel like, will it fall out? And I've heard this from other people. But the doctor explained that it's like putting a piece of sand between two pieces of bread with peanut butter on them, that your cervix is actually flat until the baby grows, and then it becomes round with the baby. So I just trusted that it would work.
Right.
That the peanut butter would hold.
Right. Oh, I love that. Wow. And so how did you feel afterwards? Like, walking out of the office, what was that like?
You just leave with hope. And I think same with the parents. They just, everyone felt hopeful. So the embryo was in London. Parents were about an hour from London, and then we were 4 hours. So we all go back to our homes, and the intended mom asked that I would take some pregnancy tests even before the actual blood test. And I was agreeable. And so whenever she asked for a pregnancy test, I would do it and send it to her. And even fairly quickly, the lines were there. They were faint, but they were there. And then she would just ask for me to do one every day and send her a picture, and the lines would get darker and darker. But we couldn't confirm the pregnancy until the next doctor's appointment. But it was exciting to feel like it was working.
Wow, right. And so how many days post-transfer did you first see 2 lines on the test?
I have all these dates written down somewhere, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say 10 days, but someone might tell me that's impossible. But the baby's a few days old when it's transferred. So the pregnancy is already a bit further along. I can't remember the exact date, but yeah.
And so what was that before you took that kind of first test, or that first test where you saw the positive lines, however faint? How were you feeling in that kind of limbo time?
I felt good. Like, I didn't know if I was pregnant or not by a feeling. The hope was telling me that I was. But I felt good. Like, I did not have any sickness. I had been on quite a bit of hormones before the transfer. Like, I think about 12 weeks of hormones before the transfer happens. And the hormones at that point were fine. My body was responding to them well. 2 weeks after the transfer, I became very, very sick with the pregnancy hormones, and maybe on top of the artificial hormones that they give you. I don't really know what made me sick, because I was not sick in my own pregnancies, but I became very, very sick. on Christmas Day. Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Oh my gosh. Wow. And so we'll come back to that in a second, but just to backtrack a little bit, how did you feel physically, kind of leading up to the transfer with, the treatments, the hormones, all the checking and the appointments? Like, how were you physically?
Nothing stands out to me. Like when I talk about it, I think, wow, that must have been exhausting. It was a lot of driving. I was working full time and doing these trips to London and had 2 kids at home. But I don't remember feeling that in the moment. I think because there's excitement and momentum behind it, I don't remember feeling exhausted or burnt out, or I was just excited and ready and physically felt good.
Okay. And then how did you feel emotionally? Because you shared kind of how you felt physically in that like 10 days post transfer. How did you feel emotionally kind of waiting to take that test post transfer?
I think it was like that feeling of, remember before I said you want it to work because you want your body to do what it's supposed to do. And I'm putting supposed to in quotes.
Right.
It's that pass or fail. Even though I firmly believe that bodies do exactly what they need to do and that it truly wouldn't have been a pass or fail. But those thoughts were creeping in, like, I hope my body performs. I hope my body does what people want it to do here.
Yeah.
Even though I don't think science would prove that my body would make the pregnancy viable or not. There's lots of other contributing factors, but I think for me, that is the one place where I did feel some pressure. Like, I want this to work. I want to pass this test.
Wow. Wow. And so then you mentioned those couple of weeks after confirming the pregnancy. Well, sorry, jumping back, when you saw that first faint line positive test, what did you feel in that moment?
I was so excited. I was just so happy to send that picture to the intended mom. Yeah. It almost had inklings of your own excitement around pregnancies because you feel so excited for them.
Right. And how was it different from and that might sound like a very obvious question, but for you personally, how was it different from when you had your positive pregnancy test from your babies?
It was very different. Even though I just said to you, the excitement felt the same, there was a shocking amount of differences. And I think it's because you spend so much time disconnecting in a healthy way. And so almost like you would, if you were asked to babysit for someone, you would gladly take the baby in or the child in. You would treat them with all the respect in the world. You would give them similar things that you would give your own kids. You would think about their health and their well-being, and you would be kind to them. But you don't think, should I keep them? Right? Could I keep them even after their parents come back to get them? Like, that's the same disconnecting that you do, is that those thoughts of it's mine never entered my brain. And so actually, now that I'm saying this, I don't even know that I had to work at disconnecting, because it just was such a natural process to disconnect. Having said that, don't picture disconnecting as in I don't care. Like, I cared as much as a babysitter would care. But it was just, that's the biggest difference, is that you're so connected, or I was so connected, maybe not everyone is, to my own pregnancies and babies as soon as I found out that they were there, where this felt like babysitting. It's the only way I can describe it.
Right. Yeah. And as you're talking to me, it sounds like some healthy boundaries.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Because Because I think if you didn't see yourself as the babysitter, that could complicate things.
And I think that's everyone's biggest worry, as observers as well as surrogates and gestational carriers. I can't tell you how many times people said, oh, I could never do that. I wouldn't be able to give the baby away. Or, will you be able to give the baby away? And we just never saw it as giving it away. We saw it as giving back. So I think that's maybe what made us be able to do this, is that part didn't seem tough. It just felt like we were just going to babysit this baby for a little while and then give it back.
Right. And you were doing this in service of this couple, as opposed to like trying to grow our own family. Like, those are two totally different things, right?
Yeah, you're right. The intention from the get-go is there. And when we have intentions, there's no surprise. And I guess there was a part of me that wondered, how will I feel at the end? And that's why I booked counseling in at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just don't know. So it is people's worry. It is on people's mind. Like, how will you feel when the baby's gone? And I guess that's a good thing that people are worried about that.
Right. And so in a lot of these discussions that I've been having lately, and for a long time, these myths of motherhood, these gendered stereotypes, I find are really affecting like every area possible of parenting. And I'm wondering, I could be reaching here, but I'd love to know your thoughts. If this gendered stereotype of, a woman's role and goal in life is to have babies, to procreate, to raise her children. And so like, if you saw a baby, you would just melt and want to take that baby home. And so of course, if you're a gestational carrier and you deliver this baby, there's no way you wouldn't be able to want to take it home, because that's your life mission as a woman.
Right. That's a really good point. You're right. It's an assumption that's put on women, and that I definitely felt, how will you be able to do that? Will you be okay? I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't be okay. I just heard that, I'm going to say the most. When people got curious, which I'm glad they did, that was the most curious question I heard repeatedly, was how will you? And that's why I found the babysitting imagery helpful, because people can relate to that. They're like, oh yeah, right. I would never consider keeping it. And it's just that you could kind of relate to, like, I'm actually almost glad when the parents come to pick the kid up at the end of a babysitting stint. And that's kind of how I felt. So you're right. It's an assumption that women want babies that they carry, because that's not always true. That there's a lot of assumptions there about, right.
Absolutely. And that we're naturally going to attach to any baby, whether it's ours or not.
Right.
Because we are female and we're born to make babies, right? And that's just not necessarily true. Right. And so that's what I was kind of hearing, in that, people's assumptions, like, I could never do that. Like, because of course, I would want to keep that child, or how could you do that?
Right.
Like, that seems impossible, because we know that women, love to have babies.
And I don't think it's something that everyone could or should do. I'm not suggesting it's easy, or that the disconnecting would be easy for everyone. But when you said the word assumption, I think that that's dead on, is that it's an assumption that we won't be able to disconnect. Or same as assumptions are made that we will be able to connect to our own children, or all the assumptions that are made.
Absolutely. Which can be so detrimental, because I was hearing, like, what I was really hearing from you was, like I said, those to me sounded like those healthy boundaries. that you had in place, and this like inherent trust in yourself, like I can do this. But it was only those assumptions from other people that you were kind of like, oh, can I do this? So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I like how you said there was a inherent trust like that. I did feel that. And I felt it after too. I felt, wow, women's bodies and science, like how amazing.
Amazing.
Like I was really in awe of what just happened from that 5 minute. Remember I said to you, the appointment was a 5-minute transfer, a piece of sand between two peanut butter breads. Like what just happened?
Incredible. Incredible. So tell me about when that sickness came in. What was that like?
I would say the sickness was the hardest part. That was one part I wasn't prepared for, as much as lawyers tried to prepare us. And I talked with someone else who was a surrogate, and she tried to prepare me. It's just one part I wasn't prepared for because it wasn't a part of my previous pregnancies. So I wasn't expecting it. And thankfully, I knew people who had been quite sick in their pregnancies. My sister was very sick in her pregnancy, so she became a coach. and I was able to also speak with, I don't think it still exists, but Sick Kids in Toronto. The Mother Risk had a nausea and vomiting helpline and MVP. And they really helped. They gave tips and tricks like don't eat and drink at the same time. Make sure you're eating high protein, freeze your meals so that they don't smell when you're eating them. I could go on, but they just were amazing.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And emotionally, how did that, experiencing that sickness, not having that with your first two, and now feeling really unwell, how did that feel for you emotionally?
That was hard because I checked out. Like I was in my room a lot, and Dave became the primary parent, and I just felt like I was kind of missing out on my family. And I just wasn't prepared for it, and also didn't feel like I should get sick. There's this belief that like when you're doing something for someone else, it should go well. It should, I should be rewarded.
Yes, I'm doing something amazing.
So when I got the sickness, it just felt like the calculator was off. Like, this is wrong. This is not how it was supposed to go. So I had to do a lot of like soul searching and remember why we said yes. Yeah. And that yes becomes a bit of an anchor when it's not going the way you had thought it would go.
Right.
And so just there wasn't regret. We just really had to hold on to our yes. We chose this. We wanted this. It's hard. Hard things do happen to people, even people who are doing nice things. And that's not a sign of goodness or badness. It just
absolutely
is.
I love that you said that. Yes. And that's why I asked how you felt emotionally, because of course, like illness can affect us in so many different ways, and we can absolutely develop, thoughts and feelings around that of like, and create meaning around it, right? Of maybe I'm not doing a good job carrying this baby, or who knows, like the myriads of thoughts and feelings that can come, right? So I love that, trying to anchor to your why. Why did we do this? And we said yes, like anchoring to your yes. And and it's, we'll get through it.
And we did. And that's the amazing part, is that there were 3 really hard months. And Dave and I still talk about it to this day, of the way that changed our relationship. He started doing things in the house that I would have typically done. And he still does them to this day, because that just became the new norm. And so there's still little things that pop up that are because of the surrogacy or because of that time in our life. And they're now nice memories. Right. But there were 3 hard months for sure.
And And so was that the first trimester for
Yes. Yeah.
you?
Yeah. The whole
Okay.
pregnancy
Right.
was different than my own. And I don't know if that's because of the hormones that my body wasn't used to. Some people say, they guess, some people guess that is it the genetic differences because the baby had its parents' genes. And I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to
Who
guess.
knows?
But the whole
Right.
pregnancy was different in that I never felt 100% well. And in my other pregnancies, I felt almost the best I had ever felt. So just
Wow.
very different.
Yeah. Very different. And so how did the pregnancy, well, and especially the 3 months of sickness, how did that impact your work?
I was doing counseling at the time and doing counseling in an office with a set schedule. And so there was definitely, I told you I got sick on Christmas Day and I was off for Christmas holidays. So there was a period of time where I
Right.
was just naturally off, which was good. And then I believe
Right.
when I was due to go back to work, I might have extended it a few more days because I was just really adjusting to diclectin and to what I needed to do to get out of bed. and and then I just ended up putting one foot in front of the other and going to work. And I did not know how I would do it, but I did it. And on one hand, it was really good for me because it was easy just to stay sick in bed. Where getting out of bed and doing something gave me something else to think about. It was
Right.
nice not to
Yeah.
think about sickness, but I came home
Right.
so tired from work. Work was all I could do. And so my family
Right.
really got the less of me for quite a few months. But Dave
Right.
really stepped up and the girls really bonded with him during that time. So there's goodness that comes out of hard situations.
Absolutely. The three of them had that opportunity to have more time
Yeah.
together, and Dave had more parenting
Yeah.
opportunities, which is
Yeah,
lovely.
it was.
I mean, it's not great that it was at your
Right.
expense in terms of
Right.
sickness, but something lovely did come
Yeah.
from that.
Yeah.
And how, like, did your kids ever express to you, kind of how they felt in that period with you kind of, just taking care of you and being really sick? Did they ever express anything about that?
They never expressed annoyance or frustration, which I think really speaks to kids at that age between 6 and 11, is that they care about getting their needs met, and their needs were getting met. So as
Right.
long as their needs were
Right.
getting met, they were good. And I
Yeah.
think that really does kind of prove that whole theory that says one strong attachment. And they
Right.
had that. They had
And they're
they're
good to
good to
go.
go. Mom was checked out in bed and they would come visit me, and um,
Mm,
they were okay. They were fine.
yeah,
They were
that's
allowed to
lovely.
ask any question they wanted to. That was always part of the plan, is it was an open book. And so they had questions and then they would almost forget about it. Like they would just kind of, if they did have a question, they would ask. And if they didn't, they would just, and one of their biggest was, could we name the baby? They felt that was solely something they should be able to do. And the
Right.
parents said, why don't you let the kids give the baby a nickname? And I thought that's a nice
Oh,
little way to include
that's
them.
sweet.
And the parents
Right.
ended up naming the baby the nickname.
Oh, Katie.
Yes. So they did get to name the baby after all.
Oh, and what did that mean for you and your
It
family?
just was such a nice like gift for the girls because they did
Yeah.
sacrifice some things for this. And so that was their one request. Can we name the baby? No, of course you can't name the baby. But then they did. So
Oh, that is so
yeah. Yeah.
lovely. Oh, that's lovely. I'm curious to know, you mentioned you're a counselor for the audience that didn't know that. Working in that space, I know what it's like to, if, having kids or people are curious, if people were pregnant. I was never pregnant in that space, but colleagues that were pregnant, their clients were always very curious, like, oh, are you pregnant? Like, what's happening? How was that navigating that for you at work? Did that kind of come up? What was that like in terms of your clients and people you interacted with?
Pregnancy is very visible, right? So you're right. It was kind of there, and people tend to, I don't know if you ever found this, but a big question people will say when they see that you're pregnant is this your first? I don't know why, but that seems to be a natural, is this your first?
Right.
So I could answer that question easily. No, it's not my first. And sometimes if people became curious enough to keep asking questions, I would just share. I would just answer because I felt comfortable to do that. But other times it would just end at, is this your first? No, it's not. It's my third pregnancy. So it didn't feel complicated. And I don't know if there's other gestational carriers or surrogates who are listening, but I always felt like it was nice to be pregnant as a way of honoring this process. So I'll explain what I mean. So you go through this job, let's call surrogacy or gestational carrying a job, right? You can't get paid for it in Canada, but it's a role. It's something you take on and you do it with all your heart, with all of your family, with all of your resources, with all of your strength. And so the pregnancy is almost a visible way of this invisible job that you're doing. It was actually when I wasn't pregnant anymore that I felt the invisibility. So while I was pregnant and people were asking whether it was clients or strangers, is this your first? It was honoring this job I was doing. It was talking about this job. It was giving voice to this invisible role that I was a part of. But when I wasn't pregnant anymore, it just felt like this abrupt ending to this huge job that I just did. And there is no t-shirt. There is no,
there's no medal.
There's no medal. There's a few extra pounds and nothing really to kind of say, this is what I just did.
Right. Yeah, because, a lot of times too, which is interesting, is like when we go through a really tough pregnancy or, even a traumatic delivery, a lot of times, I think because people are uncomfortable, they bring in this, I will call it toxic positivity of, but at least you have your baby. Right. So like you went through this trauma, this terrible thing, or a really tough pregnancy, but at least you have your baby.
Right.
Because we're so uncomfortable with just sitting with that. Right. Yeah. And so now you're like in this situation, you don't have that baby. And then also for other people too, they can't say like, well, at least you have this baby, or you can't say that either. Wow. That sounds quite heavy.
It was an abrupt ending is what I would say. And you're right. Like, I think people didn't know what to say at the end because it's done. It's over. And they knew I was okay. So what more is there to ask? But I did find myself wanting to keep talking about it. I wanted to honor it. I wanted to honor my body for what it had just done.
I am so grateful to Katie for sharing her story of being a gestational carrier and how that process and pregnancy went for her. Katie shared her story so beautifully, and I can't wait to share the rest of her story with you. Stay tuned for next week's episode where Katie shares about her postpartum experience after being a gestational carrier and how that was different from birthing her own children. Katie and I also explore what types of supports exist and could be helpful for surrogates and gestational carriers. You can find Katie on Instagram at Katie Lamport Counseling or online at mainstreamtherapy.com, and I will link all of her contact info in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports. You can also go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, and podcast episodes. Check out our new episode every Wednesday.